Okay, so let's formally start our event. Thank you very much again for Professors Amparo and Kaba for being here today. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that we are organizing. We, as a research project called the Peripheries of Law, of which myself, Bruno, Gazal, Irini, and another colleague, Rashmi, are the conveners and organizers. This research project aims at creating a legal dialogue between the peripheries and semi-peripheries of the, let's say, global order, um, in a sort of unmediated way with, the centers and the North Atlantic. So we try to give the floor to voices that are not the ones usually presenting their voices, but from a legal perspective. The webinar today is dedicated to the problem of elections. The title, as you know, is Demos, the elections, the demos in crisis. And the idea would be to analyze and reflect upon the challenges facing democracy, especially representative democracy, in these times of crisis. So we are living amidst a sanitary crisis, but before we also had many political crises unfolding all throughout the world, a sort of authoritarian wave taking hold of many different places. And the combination of the sanitary crisis, these political trends, they make represent a threat to democracy. But we could also think that this could be a turning point and it could be a time of democratic renewal if we were to adopt a more optimistic approach of the world. So I would will give the floor to Professor Kaba first, who will share his thoughts, and then Professor Amparo will also have the opportunity to present his views on the topic, and the floor will then be open to everyone who may pose their questions. The idea here is to have a very dynamic discussion with a lot of participation from the audience. So, Professor Kaba, you may have the word.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruno and your colleagues, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm greatly honored to make this presentation and to interact with you and your colleagues. That said, I think I'd also like to commend you for the choice of the topic for discussion. I think it's a pertinent topic, especially if, in relation to my position in Africa. I think the issue of representation as connected to the emerging technology, I think is slowly becoming a big issue. Many countries moving away from physical paper systems of conducting elections and increasingly relying on technology, but also there's also growing use of technology, especially social media, in terms of influencing the electoral process, but also sending the message across to the people. And yeah, so I note that you titled the presentation as a crisis. And I would agree that there's a crisis of sort, but then I think this crisis is not new, but in the context of Africa, I would think the crisis, the democratic crisis is kind of historical in that the state itself, up to this stage, I would think is still an alien entity that has not been legitimized. I think what happened at independence is that we chased the colonialists, but then we repressed them with people who were only local in appearance, but in terms of ideology and everything else, I think they saw the state as an opportunity for drawing benefits and not as an institution for service. So from this perspective, the state is basically an element of contestation where rival parties fight for the purpose of drawing benefits from the state and distributing those benefits to their constituents. So it's not a center of service to the people, but an entity where benefits can be drawn, and then those directly connected to those in power draw marginal benefits. So in this context, then when there are developments in technology, so this development in technology become a tool like any other tool, any other political tool. So it basically means that the technology is going to be used like another tool in that fight for access to the state. We had superficial reforms, I think, in the 80s and 90s. We had routinization of elections and a system of getting rid of a few leaders who had overstayed in office. But that was just that. I think we have not tampered with the root establishment of the African state. I think it's still a problematic entity, I think, which has to be tamed, and it is yet to be tamed so that it serves the interests of the people. So in this context, when information technology is superimposed on this problematic state, it becomes a tool, and we can see it when you read the judgments in the last 10 years of disputed presidential elections in Africa. You can see that almost all the judgments have an element of something being disputed in relation to the use of technology of sorts in elections. So that tells you that there is a problem, and that problem is being superimposed on what already exists. So that doesn't mean that there's anything inherently wrong with the technology. It only means that in our context, I think we have underlying problems which need to be resolved in order for technology to be of maximum benefit to the people. So if we look at some of the recent presidential elections in Africa, and in relation to the issue of disinformation, we find that there were serious allegations, for example, that companies or entities like Cambridge Analytica were involved in some elections. I think Kenya 2013 has been named. Nigeria 2015 elections were also named as where that organization was involved, and it is alleged that it was also involved in mass spread of disinformation in that context. But also beyond this, I think even if we had capacity to handle such disinformation, I think the companies that provide these services are generally located outside Africa. So even if there was goodwill, I think we have limited capacity in terms of technology to rein in the technology. However, I think I should say that it has not all been bad news, as Bruno indicated in the introduction. I think there are also emerging advantages from this. There's a research, for example, which was done by Professor Nick Cheesman and his colleagues, focusing on the Nigerian 2019 election. And they were looking specifically at the use of the social media, WhatsApp. And they established that because it is encrypted, it basically allows the opposition, which is habitually persecuted by the government. But in this case, because it's encrypted, it provides security. So the opposition is able to share information in a secure manner without, or it allows the opposition to bypass the surveillance by government. So it's able to share information without fear that the government is going to intercept that information or to punish people who are spreading that information. So the emerging of that kind of social media can be considered to be something which is of benefit to democracy in that context. And probably this accounts for the growing popularity of WhatsApp in Africa. The research by Nick Cheesman indicates that WhatsApp is now the most popular platform for sharing information in at least 40 countries in Africa. So from that perspective, I think social media is probably has potential to help fight the backlash against democracy, to help fight in this crisis, as you have titled it. So basically, in this context, WhatsApp provides the opposition political parties, but also the civil society organizations, a platform for bypassing government controls, a platform for also fighting back. Yeah, but also even for the opposition, there have been also instances where the opposition or other people use the same media for spreading disinformation. I think in the context of Nigeria in 2019, I think there was information in the context of the election spread that the other candidate had died when in fact he had not. So yeah, so even in that context, even if it's a positive thing, but also it presents challenges in terms of disinformation, and it's difficult to find or to propose a way how this could be resolved. So another thing which I would like to mention as I close my initial thoughts on this is that as we think of the crisis of representation, these platforms, clearly social media platforms, and now Zoom, which has been popularized especially under the COVID-19 lockdowns. So these are indicative that in countries like mine, where the government controls public media and also regulates the private media, so these platforms provide a platform where citizens can meet and engage and share information without getting permission from government. But in the instance where these are abused, especially at the instance of government, then or those who are in government, we don't have mechanisms for holding those who do that to account. But also, even if we had the goodwill, in many countries in Africa, we don't have appropriate registration for handling such complaints that may arise out of that context of the use of social media. For example, former British colonies, I think most of the remedies around issues here are basically common law remedies. We have not developed our own new remedies to respond to new emerging challenges presented by use of technology. But also at the same time, the host companies providing these services are outside the jurisdiction. So it means where there's a genuine problem and a remedy is required, we need to adjust our laws to provide for appropriate means of legal assistance with countries that host these. Currently, many countries do not have these mechanisms in place. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kaba. We have many topics to be explored in the discussion.
Yes.
I will now give the floor to Professor Amparo. So let me start.
So thank you very much for the invitation, and it's very nice to be with Professor Kaba. So I will draw a little bit from what he was saying. That's why we were talking about who goes first. But I will start from where you ended, Professor Kaba. I think that first of all, when we talk about crisis of democracy or topics like this in our countries, I think the key role of disinformation it's important. And you were talking about technology and especially WhatsApp and other strategies. So I think that we have seen in Brazil several strategies to undermine democratic regime through technology. So for instance, the idea of creating what Trump called once alternative facts and trying to create alternative narratives on that's very important to undermine the democracy as such. Also, there's one very good journalist in Brazil called Patrícia Campos Melo from the main newspaper, Folha de São Paulo, and she wrote a book on digital hate in the time of democracy, and she outlined several strategies that actually we have seen in Brazil. So the idea of this astroturfing, the idea of this artificial grassroots movement. So when you create a movement which is actually composed of few real people and a lot of robots and algorithms actually can create this buzz, and the idea that you are having a mass a popular movement towards something, but actually it's just an artificial movement. So we have seen that now with discussions about vaccine, and we have these weird discussions in Brazil about whether the vaccine should be mandatory or not, as if people were actually going to jail if they don't get vaccine, even before we actually have a vaccine for COVID-19. So this is artificial discussion that actually pollutes the democratic channels with nonsense talk, but at the same time, it's partially motivated by technology itself. And so this kind of disinformation target information for specific groups, and especially targeting against a certain group. So against LGBT people, the campaign for the current president was partially around this issue of against LGBT people in a country with a high numbers of violence against LGBT people. Now we are seeing a target and through technology, a target against especially women journalists, so with misogynist and sexist talk against women journalists. So we have this technology being used as a way to pollute the political channels and democratic channels with discussions that are actually deviate the real problems that we should be facing. Another issue, a second issue that deals with technology is this, what some people are calling techno-authoritarianism or technocratic authoritarianism, in the idea that with the use of massive ways of surveillance, you can actually control certain agendas. So, and this is not, to be fair, this is not from this government in Brazil. The previous government, more left government, actually used these strategies against indigenous people and environmental people and activists, especially when they were against a construction of some development projects. So the idea of building up a framework, a technological framework to control people without a democratic accountability actually can undermine democracy. And this is and using the surveillance mechanism. I was talking recently with one environmental activist, and he was making a joke saying that he sometimes say hi to the person who is listening to his calls from the intelligence agency, because this is something that people are facing. Just one example, during the climate talks, the most recent climate talks, there was intelligence people in Brazil attending those talks in open events. So doesn't make any sense to bring intelligence people in disguise to go to climate talks if it's an open event with participation of ministers and public officials and things like this. But we had this conspiracy idea that climate activists and environmental people are actually trying to undermine our sovereignty, and therefore we had to put surveillance mechanism on them. And this undermines democracy because it creates not only target specific groups and decide what issues are going to public debate, but also creates a framework of surveillance. Another thing that it's very important to understand in our democracies, and I think Brazil is a clear case of that, is a democratic deficit in terms of gender and race specifically. When you look at the numbers in our parliament, it's a joke, it's a bad joke. So we have women in parliament is only 15% of the women in parliament, 1/5. So which means that it's really, really low. Our parliament is composed of 85% of men in a population with majority of women. Black people also they are systematic, not being able to be in the parliament, especially because of the underfunding of those campaigns. And now we had a victory more recently, just a month ago, where the Superior Court of Election that deals with election, they decided that the political parties, all political parties should dedicate the amount of money, the campaign money for Black candidates, proportional to the number of the candidates. So if it's 30% of Black candidates, so you should get 30% of the money. Of course, there are problems with that because suddenly a lot of white candidates are switching towards the self-identification of race, saying that they are actually Black. And also, we have seen a disproportional number of money going to certain campaigns, much more money going to certain campaigns and not to others. So you overfund one Black candidate and then let other candidates to not receive enough money. So we are right now we are having local elections, and this is something we're gonna see how it plays out, because it's the first time that we have such a measure to deal with this deficit of democratic representation in terms of race and gender in Brazil. Also, another problem that we have in Brazil is this idea of this nationalism that is very much based on this vague idea who are the Brazilians, and it's very much related to the discourse of this white nationalism. And our current president ran for election with the slogan "My color is Brazil." So this sums up the idea of this nationalism is based on no Black people, no LGBT people. It's based on this idea of the heterosexual and white population. And this is very interesting in a very diverse and multiracial country and Black country as Brazil is. So this is something that we are witnessing as an import of the discourse of this nationalism that it comes especially from the United States. And I think that because of this discourse that it plays out in certain democracies nowadays, this nationalist discourse, we are seeing this reflect in the international arena. So we are seeing that, of course, we all know about the Make America Great Again and the stance against and the discussion against China. We have this Christian Hungary and the idea of the Christianity in Hungary, in Poland, and other places. We have the Brexit. We have all manifestations of a kind of nationalism being also play out in international arena. And we have seen that in Brazil in relation to discussion about Amazon, for instance, and how we deal with our environmental and climate issues, always in opposition to others. So saying that we are saving, that we can deal with Amazon because we don't want the people to deal with our sovereignty or to undermine our sovereignty. So this discourse also undermines the very idea of democracies playing out into international arena in a more cooperative and more solidary way, or at least in a more multilateral way. And this also is a reflection of the crisis of democracy internally in those countries. Tom Ginsburg talks about authoritarian international law, and he's talking about the a more autocratic regimes think about regime survival and not so much about cooperation. In the long term, they invest less in international institutions, and they try to undermine international institutions like United States applying sanctions against criminal court, or Brazil not understanding much what climate talks deal with. So this idea of not caring much about the international arena and only caring it about a regime survival is very key aspect and reflection at international arena of the internal crisis of democracy. And to not end my initial remarks in a very depressive way, I think there's some ways that we can try to think about renewing democracy and democratic channels. I think, first of all, trying to use technology to strengthen the impartial or at least independent journalism, and trying to foster and strengthen the institutions and of watchdog institutions and the independent institutions and the journalism institutions through the use also of technology, and try to invent the way we deal with technology and try to foster the use of technology. We are not going back to a offline world. We are going to more and more a technological world, and we need to deal with it. Second, I think that we are all in a era of fear of several things, of climate change, of the Arctic melting down, or things like this, or people losing jobs and rising inequality. And as Alexandra Ocasio said yesterday in a political ad, she said that, well, we need to turn fear into action, and then to turn fear into fuel for action. And I think that's our fears should not be against each other, but actually trying to build something up out of this fear that we are feeling in several ways. Also, for the progressive politicians and the progressive political parties, I think a lot of those political parties are based on formal labor. So they were institutionalized based on unions and based on labor. We have seen the crisis of the Labour Party in UK, for instance, or in Brazil, in other places. And I think that in a context where majority of the poor people are not actually officially in a official work contract, they're working informally, they are working in a very precarious way and not very formalized according to labor rules. We need to rethink what labor means in this context. So not only thinking about building up, which is important in itself, building up a welfare state based on contribution, based on the contribution that people pay according to their official work contracts and things like this, but also trying to think universal policies that actually address the rising inequality and the rising number of people that don't have actually those contracts, and they are the margins of the labor regulations, and trying to support them with the welfare. So now during the pandemics, we have seen something good out of the pandemics, at least in this sense of having a serious proposition and implemented this idea of the basic universal income. So the basic income and things like this will be much in need. They will not replace, and they should not replace our welfare system, our education and health and other things like this. But also we need to think about universal measures in what labor means in this society. And finally, I think that part of the reason why the extreme right is in power in Brazil is because of this idea that they manage to convince part of the poorest people and the middle class in Brazil that the only way to do emancipation, social emancipation, is through consumption. this idea that they should have more and more, and they should strive for less regulations, and strive for everyone to be independent financially and things like this. But this is more ideology than actual reality, because people are working long hours, not having rights, and thinking that they are being emancipated through this ideal consumption that is never being realized. And I think that we need to change that, and try to convince people through the democratic channels that the real way to do some kind of emancipation is actually to build policies that address the rising inequality. And we never had in our history so much wealth being produced, but at the same time, we are seeing more and more discussion of this trying to push for less and less social policies. And this is completely a paradox for me. And then we had to think ways of bridging this gap between the rising wealth that we have and we never had in human history, and at the same time, the rising inequality that we have right now. And I think that's one thing that it's in the agenda, because without that, we're going to have a democracy of poor consumers and people being disinformed by technology. And this is not the world that we want to build in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Amparo and Professor Kaba. These were very enlightful comments. I will pass the word to Ghazal, who will make some remarks.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Professors Amparo and Kaba, thank you very much for an incredibly enlightening presentation from both of you. We really enjoyed that. And I think not only did it highlight some of the questions that were already wandering around in our minds, but also created some new ones. And I think essentially the platform that we as a project want to create, the purpose of this platform is exactly that we may not necessarily have all the answers to all the problems, but that we want to create a platform where people can ask the right questions, and through that be able to perhaps in the future provide answers. I just do want to clarify something for our attendees. Please do send us your questions and comments on the question and the Q&A function. We'd love to hear from you guys so that we can have a discussion with the professors. Perhaps to start us off, if I can make a few comments. Being raised in Africa myself, obviously I feel a sort of emotional kinship to Professor Kaba's presentation, and I feel emotionally the crises that are being faced in Africa. I think an interesting thing that was raised by Professor Amparo that I want to connect with Professor Kaba's presentation was the question of who are Brazilians. So this, I think, has been a major question in Africa as well. So specifically being the problem regarding the colonial borders that Professor Kaba alluded to as well. That being that if we do not know who the Africans are, especially in South Africa, where I grew up, there's a big problem of who qualifies as South Africa and what is South Africa, because the existence of South Africa, many people that don't recognize South Africa as a country even, because firstly, the borders are colonially constructed, and secondly, that the citizens are have gained their citizenship through colonialist powers. So I think this is a very interesting question when it comes to the debate regarding elections and public participation. Who participates, who should participate, and what is the effect of these various participants on the outcomes of elections, which I think is fascinating. And with regards to, and I would like to go hear both your comments on that, as well as on the question of what Professor Amparo referred to as technocratic authoritarianism, which Professor Kaba in his opening remark referred to how those in power will draw certain benefits instead of helping those in need. So I would be very interested to hear about the connection between these concepts from both of you as well. I will perhaps give the floor to the professors to respond and to our attendees to pose their questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do I go first?
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating question. Actually, I've never thought of it. Yeah, but as you have spoken, the boundaries, as we know them today, are a colonial construct. But then it doesn't end there, because I think after independence, I think our leaders had an opportunity to rearrange things. They didn't. Even though in the context of Africa, I think on paper, at least, we have a framework trying to drive us towards ultimately the United States of Africa. And we're supposed to start building from a regional perspective. So the regional organizations are supposed to be our building blocks towards ultimately that universal African state. But that has not yet happened. And as you have spoken in the context of South Africa, I think looking at those xenophobia attacks, I think that raises serious questions whether that idea is going to be realized. But when it comes to elections, in terms of who qualifies to vote, generally, I think countries have used two standards. The first one is the standard of residence. So generally, anyone who is resident in that country at a particular time would qualify. And I believe that was the criteria that was used in South Africa in 1994, because there was no voter register then in 1994 when we were moving from apartheid to the new democracy. But then many countries opt to use the citizenship standard. But I think the citizenship standard creates a sense or feeling of them and us. So you create two categories of people. So those are considered to be citizens, then are entitled to make the decision and in terms of who should be the leader of the country. So these are difficult to reconcile, because when it comes to party politics or to national politics, and where there's a struggle for the distribution of the national cake, usually politicians appeal to the emotions of people and usually put the blame on foreigners. For example, in the last election in South Africa, I think politicians were openly saying foreigners are taking your jobs. So I think it's not something which is limited to South Africa. In my own country, it is an issue. So when you have that kind of politics, then it's very unlikely that the debate of whether people should qualify for voting by residence or citizenship will be addressed in a more reasonable manner. I think when politics are tilted from that angle, I think you are more likely to have standards of only citizens being allowed to vote. And I think in the context of Africa, that is the dominant standard which is applying currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaba. Professor Amparo?
Yeah, so no, thank you very much for the questions. I think they're very interesting. And I think when we look from the colonial perspective, it's interesting to see that the very idea of a nation was also built and started with the well, as a nation as we know now with the colonialism. it is big, with especially with the coming of the royal family, Portuguese royal family to Brazil, and then where you had the first schools, the medicine and law schools, and then you start creating also the police, partly to control enslaved people. So we had this the birth of the modern Brazil in that area, in that arena. And after, for 200, for 100 years, so for a century, people that didn't know how to write or to read could not vote. So, and of course, most of those people were Black people, and the majority of the population. So the very idea of a citizenship and being part of the political system was also very much undermined for most of the people in Brazil, even when we actually held elections. Let aside all the striking inequality and everything that actually managed to let people outside out of these of the discussions of the political elites. And then later on we had this system of political elites controlling certain states, and then and still now we have political parties very strong in certain states, and they basically control the police forces, and they control the state, and they control all the state apparatus. A little bit of what Professor Kaba was saying about this instrumentalizing the state for your own purpose and not for a democratic rule or for the public itself. And so I think that, of course, countries are myths. They don't actually exist. They only exist in the sense of our creation, and a political creation, and enforcement through violence and history. And of course, we have common culture, and we have common histories that can ground these myths. But in the end of the day, the borders are myths that are created in order to compartmentalize power. And of course, I like very much Brazil or Zambia or France, but they are all myths. And because in the sense of they don't exist in reality, nature, but they actually, their reality are a political reality that we created through our common history, culture, and also use of violence. And this idea, who are the Brazilians, it's very important, because for 300 years, slaves were not considered part of their property, not a citizen. In Brazil, we had 300 years of slavery. After when we had actually held elections, for 100 years, people could not vote if they didn't know how to write or read. So this is also part of the myth that we create for ourselves of who are the actual Brazilians. And if during this time of after post-abolition of slavery, we had this idea of whitening the population and creating this our population will be wider, and the racist ideas that are related to that. And this was also the idea of trying to create a Brazilian people who were wider and not descend of the slaves that were in Brazil for 300 years. And this is also a political myth created based on violence and based on power. So even now, where we actually had where we have this mandatory voting, and in theory everyone votes, and we have a full democracy going on. But this full democracy and this political mobilization of people actually are moving around within these colonial structures. Very elite law schools, medicine schools that were created during the colonial times, the distribution of power that were drawn on the colonial lines in the states, and very much based on political elites. There are families that are in power since the time of the colonial times. And they are there in power in Brazil, in several states, and they are the political families in those states. And this is very much a colonial colonial heritage that we have of understanding who are the Brazilians. So I think that throughout the history, Brazil struggled with this idea of how to cope with its history of slavery. Some part of the history we try to whiten the population, and later on we try to conceive the idea of this Brazilian race, of this multiracial democracy, that everything's fine here, although it wasn't. And then this idea of certain parts of the country, like São Paulo, seeing themselves as the very avant-garde, very very progressive and very, not progressive, but in the sense of very economically advantaged. And this also created a disparities in the country, because there's a lot of prejudice against people from the north and the northeast, from the people from the south and the southeast part of Brazil, in kind of in the dynamic, in the regional dynamic on who is the actual Brazilian and who is not. So I think this is all created through history, but most of the time for distribution of power and gaining power and regaining power and fighting over power, and less a discussion about how to build a democracy for everyone. And in Brazil, the last thing I would say, a fun fact is that some authors would say that we invest first in policies in social policy to get the support of the people without actually giving them the right to vote. So we had this Getúlio Vargas in the dictatorship. So where we actually had the foundation of our labor law and some regulations for more pro-poor regulations, and without actually having the right for people to vote and to be part of the democratic regime, which is a different kind of itinerary than we see in other contexts, especially in Europe, where we had the vote and then later on the social policies. And in Brazil, sometimes in part of our history, we actually inverts that. But I would say that we invert this bringing first the social aspect of citizenship and later on the civil and political part of citizenship, because it was not actually a way of emancipating people or actually building a democracy. It was a way of buying people through certain concessions that actually didn't reinvent the way public services and public policies are doing were being done, but actually to try to cope the labor unions and try to cope with the people to maintain power. So I don't know if I answer your question, but a little bit like this, I think.
Definitely, that certainly did. Thank you very much, Professor Amparo. I think Bruno has a question, and there's one in the
chat.
Yes.
So I actually want to tie this question in the chat with something that was said in the addresses of both Professor Amparo and Professor Kaba, because both of them they raised this problem of, first of all, let's say multilateralism. So how to solve these problems of democracy through regional cooperation, a sort of African United States. Then we have also the question of internal cores and peripheries, as referred to by Professor Amparo. So we have São Paulo being a sort of core in Brazil, and me myself coming from Bahia, which is a state in the Northeast themselves, like always looking to São Paulo as a reference and trying to reproduce these sorts of politics that are political discourses and policies that are produced there. So we have those tensions between, as I said, multilateralism and internal cores peripheries within regions and countries themselves. And the question posed in the chat is very interesting because it actually addresses the problem of the BRICS. And we know that the BRICS, they were created as a sort of voice or as the leaders of a so-called global south, of a so-called new world order, or the peripheral countries that were not in the North Atlantic, and they try to foster a certain voice of these countries. But we also know that Brazil, China, Russia, South Africa, they are in their respective regions very powerful players. So there's a tension between this representation as well. Brazil is not the same as Suriname, such as South Africa is not the same as Eritrea, right? And then Joyman Lee, he poses the following question. Is there any meaningful dialogue at the level of BRICS on some of these questions that are being addressed here? Is it possible to say that many of these emerging powers from the global south are actually reinforcing the shift towards an authoritarian international law and the weakening of international institutions? How can progressive forces in the developing world gain ground when geopolitical forces seem to be moving precisely in the direction of marginalizing them? And then there's a parenthesis. And the problem, as you pointed out, isn't just the West, but non-Western powers that are made in the image of Western colonialism and nationalism. So maybe if we could have some thoughts on these issues. Um,
So I will start because the other two times Professor Kappa started. I think that is a very interesting question. Thank you very much for that, because I think we can answer it in different levels. So I think that the original idea of the BRICS was that to try to counter strike, at least in the narrative and in the cooperation, this Western focus international politics and law. So they try to create this forum of very powerful players in their regions, and now China are very powerful globally, to try to think through and establish other institutions like the Bank of BRICS and other institutions to counter the institutions that were developed by the West, especially since the Bretton Woods conference in the 40s onwards. So I think that to try to create new institutions and new ways of cooperation and counter narrative globally. The problem is that well, Brexit is very diverse in itself, and with the democracies and non-democracy in the BRICS. So this is a problem in itself, because it's not a very cohesive group that can counter-strike globally the narrative. Also, nowadays, especially talking about Brazil, the relationship between Brazil and China is very tense, especially because President Bolsonaro is it's buying the rhetoric and the ideology of Trump and the right in the United States, dealing and buying this attack against China. So this makes it very difficult to foster more and more cooperation inside of the BRICS, because our geopolitical alliance, at least under this presidency, is more towards the United States, which makes a little bit difficult to have this to invest time in the BRICS development. And which is ironic also, because China is a key player and one of the most important trade partner in Brazil. So that's kind of ironic. But at the same time, the common narrative I think for mainstream Western analysts of international politics is to see that, well, our institutions, international institutions, are being attacked and being undermined, especially because of the rise of China and because also Russia is not playing by the rules much for a long time. So that's a problem, and that's why we have a crisis of international organizations. And I think that's not really the case, or at least not the full story. We have actually attacked on international organizations coming from the Western democracies. So part of Europe is drawing is in nationalism. United States is since the day one is attacking institutions like ICC. Now in the pandemics, the World Health Organization. United States fought a trade war with China and didn't bother to talk about to deal this within the scope of the International Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization. So this is very much also a play that's coming from the nations that built this international order, this liberal international order, and they are also undermining that. The Brexit and all of things like this are also undermining the very core institutions that those countries with their colonial power or with the new imperialist power, they created those institutions, and they are undermining them as well. So I think that when we look at when we divide the threat to international organizations between democracies and non-democracies, we have to deal with the idea that a lot of democracies are also moving toward autocratic regimes, and in autocratic regimes, whether they have some democratic tone or not, they don't like international cooperation, they don't like the multilateralism. And I think that we need to rethink also is a good time also to rethink multilateralism, to actually embrace the new new geopolitical powers that are rising in several places. So you cannot think about multilateralism nowadays without thinking about the rise of South Africa, Kenya, the importance of Brazil, Mexico, Japan, Germany, with those powers that are, all of them are not part of the Security Council. They are not, sometimes they are left aside in major discussions, and we had to think, we had to build a political and international order based on those, also on the diversity of the world, and not with only with the division between China and the United States, because this is only will bring a division and not actually build a multilateral world with that is based on cooperation. And finally, there's a very interesting book, I forgot the name of the authors right now, but there's an interesting book published, if I'm not mistaken, by Yale University Press recently. The name of the book is Trade Wars Are Class Wars. And they are, it's interesting because their thesis is basically that the trade war with the United States, between the United States and China, it's not so much explained by the interest of each state. Actually, it's the interest of the elites that run those states. And this makes our idea a little bit more complicated, because when we look at the countries, very unequal countries like Brazil or South Africa or Russia and other places, sometimes their interaction in the international arena is not fully explained by the interests that we would see their national interests. Sometimes it's the interest of the certain elites in fighting those wars, in the trade wars and economic wars, that they run those countries. And sometimes those elites are also global elites. Their money travel around. We all know about the Panama Papers. So this is something that we had to cope also. I think the international analysis of the current situation is very much focused on division between the United States and China, and we had to think about the polarity and the multipolar world that exists with all those different powers, but also bear in mind the divisions inside of those alliances like Brexit, and inside of each of those countries, because sometimes the wars between countries can be actually wars between elite of those countries and not so much serving the national interests of those countries.
Thank you, Professor Amparo. Professor Kaba, your response?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would agree with Professor Amparo, especially on the BRICS and the role of China. So I'm not going to repeat on that. But just to emphasize the issue of multilateralism and regional cooperation in Africa, I think the regional organizations potentially could play a major role, but they are generally not playing that role adequately. And I think at the African or AU level, I think part of the problem is goes back to the foundation of the African organization. I think one of the values at foundation was the principle of non-interference. So it was seen that if one country comments on what is happening in another country, that was seen as interfering in domestic matters of another country. So yeah, the countries tended to hold back. But also, I think, apart from what was enshrined in the actual document, is that many of the leaders, I think, in the life of the OAU, came to power through dubious means. I think this was the time when military regimes were popular, and also one-party regimes were common. So it was going to be impossible for one who came to office in a non-legitimate manner to criticize another colleague who did the same. So from a historical perspective, I think that presented problems and contradictions, if anyone wanted to act from that angle. But I think from the transformation of OAU into the African Union, I think there has been slight improvement. I think democratic norms at least have been written down in the founding documents. So you find democratic norms. And now we have even a specific charter, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which commits the continent to democratic standards. And also some regions, like especially ECOWAS, I think have developed governance frameworks. And in the case of ECOWAS, I think we saw them acting in the case of Gambia, when the president clearly lost an election, but he wanted to stay in office. I think ECOWAS as a regional body mobilized military, the armies, and that forced the president to leave the country. So from that perspective, I think there's been marginal improvement. But then when we look closely at elections, I think we still have problems in that many people who manipulate elections still find a way of staying in office. I think the most recent troubled election in Africa, I think probably the most well known is the Congo 2018. I think the election, as everyone knows, it was clearly rigged. All the observers were unanimous that the ruling party never won that election. But then there was very little coming from the African Union and even the SADC region. Yeah. So in this context, I think when the regional bodies are kind of weak and scared of pronouncing themselves in relation to democratic deficits in other country, that creates opportunities for external organizations to play a more relevant role. So for example, in my country, Zambia, the 2016 election was disputed. That threw the country into a big, into a chaotic situation. I think there was a lot of tension, leading to the arrest of the opposition leader and he was charged for treason in 2017. So the country was in tension, and none of the regional organizations actually interfered or intervened to resolve the crisis. So the organization that came to the rescue of the country to resolve that was the Commonwealth. So they sent the Commonwealth a representative to come and diffuse that tension, and that is how the opposition leader was released. So I think the regional cooperation could play a role. There's room for it, and we have adopted standards now, only that they need to be implemented, they need to be enforced. When that does not happen, I think external players like the Commonwealth and the European observer missions, that kind of stuff, they're given more relevance. But if we played that role ourselves, then we would make these organizations redundant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Amparo and Kaba. I actually have a follow-up to what you have both just presented. And so I have an unpopular position, and I would really love to hear your comments on it. So to broadly outline the position, it's essentially that, and I will highlight it with two examples from both your responses now, but broadly that the concept of democracy is not necessarily the best form of governance for all countries. Okay, and I'd like to highlight that. I mean, it's very broad, right? So it's a lot more detailed than that, but to highlight it with two points. Firstly is what Professor Amparo was referring to with regards to the literacy of people and their participation in elections, right? I will use the example of India, where for the elections, they have not only so the ballots are not only in writing, but they have pictures as well, especially for the more rural regions where they make sure that these are more prominent. Okay, so they use pictures and images to represent the different parties, right, in order to help those who are illiterate to also participate in the democracy. So I think this is a great move in order to better bring in the democracy, but keeping in mind that the conception of democracy, so this participation of the electorate in the framework of democracy is created by those who already have the education which relates to this participation, right? So it, in its nature and by framework, excludes those who do not have the literacy as required by the West or European qualifications. So that's in my first point. And second, the second one relates to Professor Kaba and mentioning the non-interference principles. So this non-interference, once again, is fantastic when it is implemented against those who are, let's call it, equal with one another. So, you know, non-interference for African countries amongst each other, or non-interference of an African country against a European country, right? But this doesn't quite seem to apply when it comes to this hierarchical international standard, where the Western countries are, you know, quite free to make comments on, you know, the global peripheries or global South, if you will, where, you know, they very comfortably make comments. And again, I think this is within the, you know, framework of democracy which has been created, and then, you know, others who, you know, where it's being implemented to be forced into that framework, right? So I find both of these a little bit problematic, and I find both of them to be reflective. Perhaps I'm, you know, in a little bit of denial, but I find both of these to be a little bit reflective of the problem, which brings me to my position of whether democracy is in fact the best form of governance for non-Western or non-European, let's say, states. And I would love to hear your comments.
Thank you very much for that question. Very intriguing question, yeah, and yeah, it's a question that basically forces us to think hard. So democracy is not best form of governance. I think most of the debate around that issue narrowly conceives of democracy in terms of elections. But I think democracy is broader than elections. For example, when you read the book by Dambisa Moyo, which discusses that, it's called Age on Chaos, where she's arguing that in Africa we should cancel elections because politicians look at short-term interests and they tailor development projects with an eye on winning an election, and that kind of development is not sustainable. But then she's reducing the democracy to elections. But in my view, democracy is broader than elections. I think it speaks of broader human values like accountability, transparency, and other social goods. So when looked at that from that perspective, I think democracy is something which has not been imported into Africa, and I think it existed in our pre-colonial societies. I think when you read historical manuals and how odd societies were running themselves, I think you'll see that. Probably one of the most popular descriptions you would find about traditional democracies in Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom. He describes how his uncle, who was a chief, was running his territory. And the description you'll find there was that actually the chief was always the last to speak, and he allowed everyone, or at least everyone was allowed to speak, and openly criticized the regent. And the regent or the chief was always at the center of criticism, and he was not allowed to answer back to criticism. And everyone who came for a meeting was allowed to speak. It didn't matter your status in society. So I think when you look at democracy from broad values, I think it's difficult to argue that this is foreign or is not the best form of governance in Africa. I think it should be looked at from a broader perspective and not just from the angle of elections. But even from an electoral perspective, the current problems with elections should not be used as a measure of the acceptability of electoral democracy by the people. For example, the surveys by Afrobarometer indicate that the majority of Africans surveyed prefer electoral democracy as opposed to, for example, military dictatorships or any other forms of dictatorships. So there's empirical evidence also supporting the views that the ordinary people agree that they need electoral democracy. So the defects we see now are not an indication that the people have rejected electoral democracy. But I think, as we have indicated, I think the problems emanate from our elite. I think they manipulate the state so that it serves their narrow interests. It is not as a result of democracy not finding rich soil on the ground. There's an issue of, you gave an example of in India where ballots have the pictures of candidates. I think in Zambia we do the same. Since 2006, actually, we have been doing the same. But I think that by itself does not address issues of election manipulation, where our systems are weak, where, for example, the results are manipulated by the Electoral Commission itself. That does not help. So, for example, when you read the judgment of 2017 in Kenya, so the problem was not with voting, the problem was not with the ballots, but after everyone had voted, the results were tampered with in the server. So even if you do all the nice things before that, but then if you have an electoral commission that colludes with one party, then you could still have challenges. Yeah, and then the final issue raised is the role played by education in democracy. Yeah, clearly, I think education plays a key role in democracy, but I think that should not be overblown because there's no evidence, I think, to show that the democratic deficit in Africa is as a result of low levels of literacy. I don't see that correlation. If we could go back to the same story of Nelson Mandela, I think we are dealing with a pre-colonial kingdom, and people then did not go to conventional modern schools. But they were able to run their affairs. They understood the values of good governance in that context. So from that perspective, I think, although education is key and we should not belittle it, but I think the values which underpin our lives as human beings are not just limited to those who are educated. I think these are values which are accessible to every human being, in my view. Thank you.
Well, I fully agree with Professor Kaba on that one. And I think that what he said, I agree completely. And I think that, well, I think we need to broaden the idea of what is democracy. And I think when we look at democracy from a critical perspective, and I mean the critical studies, and I think that you can see also democracy not as not only as an institution and regular elections, but also as a way of life. And I think that as to look at democracy as a way of life where you build solidarity, where you have horizontal and participatory mechanisms of decision making, this can actually the local democracy or the communities that engage with each other in order to deal with the problems not in a structural, in a hierarchical way, but in a cooperative and a solidary way. So I think that this is also democracy, and this is also building up democracy. And I think that if you look at the history, especially in Latin America, for instance, landless movements and the way they organized themselves in a very democratic way, and didn't need to have this education elite, the elite education in order to build to build democracy and build the ways of doing democracy in landless movements, in the Black movements, or in other movements where you have actual democratic way of doing things. So I think that's one that is that. And also I think that when you look in the history, major wars and imperialism and colonialism was built up from very elite education. So I can also make the counter argument saying that, well, maybe less education is important for people. I'm joking, of course, but it's you can also look at the way that several structures of oppression were built by very educated people. So maybe when we look at the way people are doing the democracy on the daily basis, on their communities, on their neighborhoods, on their families, and trying to challenge structures of power, maybe we can learn more of better ways to reinvent the institutions and the state to be more and more democratic. And I think also democracy is a constant struggle, as Angela Davis said once here in Brazil, and I think that it's because the constant struggle is a unfinished project. So that's why I think that it's an unfinished project, because the United States for a long time it was, as Du Bois will say, it's a slavery democracy. For a long time, the France and other places were imperial democracy or a colonial democracy. It's an unfinished project because it's also in the making. And I think our struggle and our task is to always develop this democracy towards a better system and also a better way of life. And I think that there is no evidence to support that our autocratic regimes are better at doing things like dealing with hunger and dealing with extreme inequality, and whether the dictatorships are better at addressing structural problems of inequality, because they can be more efficient in a way or another, but they can also be more oppressive. And the book of the classic book of Amartya Sen shows that, well, democracy can actually bring more participation, and therefore the problems that actually matter for people, then they can be put on the table, and then people can discuss and try to make it better. So I think that in that sense, I would say that to think about democracy not being good for non-Western countries because it's because of their level of education or things like this. This is also a colonial thought, I would say, if I may say, because it's also is a way to look at the others as lesser, and not looking at the ways the several communities in the continent in Africa, in the continent of Africa, are structured in a less hierarchical way, and not looking at the movements in Brazil and other countries in Latin America that are very participatory and very democratic historically, like the landless movement, women's movement, Black movement. So I think that when we look at the history from this angle, I think that democracy is not a foreign or Western concept that is brought up to Brazil or to other contexts, but actually is something that is enshrined, I think, in the very human ability to deal with their own lives in a way that is not oppressive. And I think democracy is also about that. It's not only about having elections constantly, of course it is, but also we have constant elections because we have a constant way of living that is not oppressive, and then we always are able to rethink the way we govern ourselves. And I think that's a democratic way of doing it, and people in Africa, in Latin America, and other places are doing that for centuries.
Thank you very much, professors, for your insights. Maybe because we're running out of time, and as a closing, I would like to make one comment and a question. Connecting this discussion on representative democracy to something that was said by Professor Amparo, I feel that one of the problems of representative democracy is precisely this relation with consumerism and the transformation of electoral processes themselves into products for consumption. And this turns representative democracy into an easy prey for campaigns of disinformation, for the production of politicians that follow a certain standard and cater for a certain public. And we leave sort of like in a secondary stage the matters of collegiality, horizontality, deliberative decision making. So maybe to have your thoughts and maybe point us towards an optimistic path. How can we enlist, let's say, legal and institutional imagination to the production of a more, let's say, direct or at least participative type of democracy in the years to come? If we can have your insights, I think this would be an interesting concluding note to the seminar.
Kaba, do you want to start, or? Yeah.
You can take it.
Yeah, so I think that, well, that's a good question. And I think that we had in the recent history examples of this more participatory democracy. I think that in some cities, in Brazil, we had this a participatory budget, and people were going there and participating in the budget. And I think that also even now with the more with the participation of people from in the progressive and in the right, also people are feeling that they are participating more. And I think that's one of the ways, one of the results of technology. People are engaging with politics more and more, and therefore they feel they are participating directly in democracy. And this is something that of course can go towards a more authoritarian and more autocratic regimes, but also can foster people's participation in politics. And this is something that is good. And so I think that technology helps in engaging the participation of people in decision-making process, and or consultation or referendum. And I think this all is good, of course, respecting the rights of people, especially the minority groups that should not be target of those decision making, because otherwise they don't have rights at all. But I think that it's interesting also your point about the people looking at the public policies as something to be consumed, or like a consumption product. I remember the Economist a few years ago, they coined a term, Starbucks politics, which I found very interesting. It's like when you go to Starbucks, then you decide what you're gonna drink. So I want a latte, but like this and like that and like that. So you customize your experience of having a coffee instead of just going there and order whatever they have. And this idea, it's transposed to politics sometimes, where people would go and say, well, I want the best public policy to me. And how can I have the best public policy customized towards my needs? to addressing my needs, and this is also very problematic. So when we have participation, we are always struggling with the idea that you're not going there to get just what you want as an individual or as a consumer, but you're going there to create a sense of a community where you, of course, want to get something for yourself as well, or for your family or for your community, but you're going there also to understand the challenge that other people are facing and trying to get to the best solution that is at least optimal for most of the people. And this is the challenge, because when you have a very kind of participation that is based on typing something on your phone and participating in a census online or something like this, you don't get the sense of the real challenge that states is facing. And then you can look at the politics as a Starbucks politics that you can customize according to your needs. And I think that's a constant struggle. And in Brazil, especially because we are a very unequal country, this leads to certain interest groups being very strong in the state. So we have high-level public servants. I'm not talking about the teachers and the public teachers and the health professionals that are there struggling with the low income, but I'm talking about the judges and the high-level in public servants in Brazil. They manage to cope the state to have 60 days of vacation per year and have super salaries and things like this. So they are using the state as a way of doing Starbucks politics, but they are saying that in a way that, well, it's better for the country that we have this kind of policies, and we don't have to waste money in social policies and things like this. And this is very dangerous. So to say that participation is important in the budget, in politics, through technology as well, but it has to be, if you want to overcome the deficit and the crisis of democracy, this needs to be thought through with the idea of a public interest and with the idea of cooperation. Otherwise, it will just be one additional way of people doing this kind of a customized politics that is very individualistic and will just give more power to the interest groups that have more power to cope with the state.
Yes, thank you very much. Just to quickly add my voice on participative democracy, I think there are things that could be done to enhance participatory democracy. And the first one, I think, is to seize on new opportunities. We have already talked about social media. I think some of the platforms that are coming on board, I think, allow citizens to bypass government. So they provide new opportunities. The second point, I think, is also that we should build on local knowledge. So as scholars, we should be open to everyone. It doesn't matter where they come from, but that shouldn't be at the expense of building our own capabilities and research capacities as Global South scholars. So we should build our capacities and do proper research and help our governments to make policies and laws that are properly researched. The third one, I think, is that as we wage this war of enhancing our democracy, is that as the Global South, I think we shouldn't accept to be measured by lower standards than the West. So, for example, when you look at many elections, especially recent ones in Africa, many election observers, including from the West, I think, pass these elections as credible, even where they were patently defective. Two good examples, for example, Malawi and Kenya. In those elections, almost all the international observers said, yeah, apart from a few problems here and there, the election was perfect. But when you look at the anomalies that were unearthed in the evidence which was produced in the judgments, that shows you that I think when the West observers are looking at us, they're measuring us at a lower standard. I think there's a standard which wouldn't be acceptable in their own countries. So I think we shouldn't accept to be measured as lower human beings and accept lower standards. The standards that are used, for example, to measure democracy in Zimbabwe shouldn't be accepted across the global South. And then finally, I think we should also draw on each other's experience as global South. Many of our countries are contextually dealing with similar problems. I think we share historical problems of, for example, colonialism, that kind of stuff. We share now, I think, challenges of how to deal with a dominant China, that kind of stuff. So we can learn from each other and see how we respond to these odd and new challenges. I think from that perspective, we have an opportunity to collaborate with each other and build on each other's experiences and knowledge. So once more, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm greatly honored and wishing you all the best in future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, to Professors Amparo and Kaba, we are absolutely delighted to have had you here with us today and to have gained the insights that you shared with us. I personally have made some great strides in my thinking due to your contributions and interventions. So thank you very much for that. I would also like to thank my co-organizers, Bruno Nirini and Rashmi, who's not here with us right now, as well as our attendees for being here with us today and participating in this wonderful session. The recording of the session will be made available as well on our website, www.peripherieesoflaw.com. So please feel free to refer back to that. And we hope to see you all in the next webinar, which will be equality in socioeconomic rights, and that will be taking place on the 11th of November. So we look forward to seeing you all again there. And once again, thank you to our speakers for sharing your insights with us. Have a wonderful day to everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.